You're watching TelecomTV's exclusive video coverage of the OPNFV Summit held here in San Francisco. And now we're going to discuss bringing openness into closed systems. It's working with telcos. From an historical perspective, telcos have adopted closed proprietary approaches to their technology and solutions. Now they're introducing openness. To help me discuss this today, I'm joined by Chris Wright, who is VP and Chief Technologist at Red Hat, and John Zanos, who is VP Cloud at Canonical. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us again on TelecomTV. Chris, if I can start with you, why is it? What happened? Why have telcos made the move away from talking about and looking at closed systems to more open ones?
Well, there's a real business urgency here. So the trend right now for the telcos is sort of flattening revenues and growing utilization of their network. And that's not an awesome, sustainable state to be in. So they're looking at how they can move more rapidly. And using systems that are closed and vertically integrated, which don't typically move as quickly, aren't going to help them get to the place they need to be business-wise to answer this sort of sometimes I call it existential threat for their businesses.
John, why have they moved from close to it? Why are they even considering open?
A number of things, and I agree with Chris. I mean, first of all, the competitive landscape has changed, technology has changed, and the rate of innovation's changed. So, a handful of years ago, not too long ago, telcos competition was other telcos. Now they're competing against Google, Facebook, Airbnb, not directly, but people that are supplying services and in doing so, consuming their network very rapidly. And at the same time, applying price pressure in terms of what the carriers can charge to their end users. So all of a sudden, more utilization, new competition, and at the same time, price pressure. So what does that drive? The need to create commodity services to drive costs down. So to Chris's point, what they used to supply as an integrated or consume as an integrated solution, now they're breaking it apart to take cost out of the equation.
But for decades, the telecoms business has been standards driven, meticulous standards that take a lot of time to develop. There's a process, and that process has been going on for decades. With NFV, and NFV in the telco world, we've only been talking about it for 2-3 years now. We're starting to see a different approach. It's almost like a speeding up. But do telcos still need to go through this process, the traditional standards process, and where does open come into this? Where does open NFV kind of sit alongside Etsy's work on creating NFV?
Well, so first of all, on the standards front, standards are really critical when you're taking two separate components that are trying to create the same implementation and interoperate. And those requirements are going to persist. We're not going to throw away TCP/IP, for example. But if you are building from a common set of code bases, you can ensure some form of interoperability without needing to re-implement every time this vertically proprietary integrated stack. So just simply having an open platform that we're working on together brings some of the standardization to the picture. And then the other point that I think is really important for us as an OPNFV community is to be involved in the standardization process so there's a feedback loop. The current process is geared towards hardware development cycles, which are long. So you really want to make sure you got it right up front. You're going to implement it your own way in your own hardware. We're doing things in software now. The pace is much faster. We can respond to things that we didn't get right the first time quickly without the cost incurred of retaping out hardware. So the standardization process, it's still important, but it plays a different role.
John, do you see things the same way there?
Yeah, in many ways. I mean, I think there's no way that standards are going to disappear, to Chris's point. They're inherently part of how making sure the network works together. I mean, it's just great that you can turn on your phone in Mongolia and still make a call to New York. And then the next morning get on a plane and go to China and make a call to London, right? That's incredible stuff. That's the foundation of standards, the interoperability. But doing that with an eye to rapid innovation, to Chris's point, software speed, is really what we're trying to do in OPNFV. So I think in the idea of taking those standards and creating a loosely coupled framework that you can innovate rapidly under a model of openness that allows multiple carriers that typically don't collaborate to collaborate is what we're trying to accomplish.
So we're kind of looking at the standards as you say, a framework to work inside. So it's maybe loose is the wrong word, but it's a standard whereby you can innovate and can do different things outside of that main standards process.
That's right. I mean, imagine just applications, and if an application's set of interfaces are just defined by a standard because you're implementing an operating system in a unique way each time, the standard is critical. If you're using the same operating system, you still need to understand what the APIs are, but that process, that rigor of predefining exactly what those interfaces look like is just simply not needed. You still need to have some documentation and clarity of what's useful and ubiquitous, but you don't need that same exhaustive upfront work.
And I think that starts developing into a set of guardrails, right? Because what we really want to do is allow for interoperability, but also choice, right? One of the things we hear constantly from the carriers is no vendor lock-in, disaggregating the stack and allowing some flexibility as well as commoditization at certain layers. I think by having interoperability and standard guardrails, we're able to guarantee that and then still achieve the flexibility that the carriers want.
So there's nothing wrong with having an approach that isn't 100% open sourced or open standards. A lot of it is, a high percentage is, but within that there is a bespoke element that is more proprietary, but it gives the individual customer the competitive edge.
I think the reality for the foreseeable future, there will not be an open source only model or a proprietary only model. There'll be an opportunity to combine those and make decisions, logical decisions on what's important and what's proprietary, and what's important and can be open. My personal view is the app layer is going to afford the opportunity for some coexistence of proprietary and open. But below that, there's going to be a drive for commoditization. And as you drive to commoditization, openness is a great way to commoditize and still allow innovation at that layer.
We look at the benefits that NFV and OpenNFV will bring to telcos, and this avoidance of vendor lock-in is very, very important to them. But what about some of the pitfalls? Is it a case that a lot of these telcos perhaps don't have the skills in-house, especially the software skills, and they've got to kind of reinvent or restructure their teams to basically innovate on top of this?
It's absolutely true. There is a cultural shift needed to adopt to this different model, and there's a skill set, a lack of skill set. So you need training to help the operations teams really get comfortable with this new operating model. We've seen some service providers invest heavily in that training program so that they can help transition their staff from the old world to the new world, because they won't be successful without that. They can also still lean on their vendors, so the vendors aren't evaporating, right? We're still there, we're still providing support, we're still helping with consulting services. So there's a journey that we can go on together to achieve this transformation. But absolutely, inside the telcos, they'll need to really understand the cultural shift and the new skill sets at a really fundamental level.
Yeah. I mean, John, are we seeing sufficient quantities of telcos and service providers fully understanding this, or is it just a case of some of the larger telcos are the ones who are actively participating at this stage, and there's a lot more who are maybe just sitting on the sidelines and just seeing how things are turning out?
I would say that this is just a market reality that applies to everybody. The pace is different from carrier to carrier, the tier ones, the tier twos, but the requirement is the same. So for them to be successful in the new software-oriented world, they're going to have to play. To Chris's point, they have partners and vendors that are going to help them, and we have a role in that. But they also have a role and a responsibility themselves to build the skill set that will allow them to compete in a marketplace that's going to require that. So when you look at some of the largest carriers like AT&T, you can see them moving very quickly in this direction. Then when you go to a smaller regional carrier, they're still moving in that direction, maybe at a different pace, and maybe the ultimate size of that team won't be quite as large, but it will exist. It has to exist.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things that we'll see is the really large tier ones that are already leading the way are investing in their internal resources in ways that they may be able to take on some systems integration roles themselves. As you get to the smaller, more regional carriers, they're probably going to look for more bespoke solutions from their vendors, still built out of those same open source components largely, but just without taking on the complete burden of owning it themselves. Just they won't have the bandwidth or skill set.
Final question for you both. What more can we do as a community, OPNFV, what can we do to encourage more take-up and involvement of telcos and just move this process along? What has to come next?
That's a great question. First, I think it's important to understand that this is an iterative process rather than a moment in time that all of a sudden you achieve and check the box and move on. As such, I think as a community, it's really a collaborative effort. As we're doing already, collaboration in terms of creating code, cross-training, and bringing in new participants, the smaller carriers we were just talking about. You know, the great thing about an open source project, you don't need 5,000 people to participate. You're going to have 2 engineers, you're going to have 55 engineers, you're going to have 500 engineers. Either way, that contribution is valuable. And that's what I think we have to do more of.
Chris?
Well, we really have to learn from each other. So a lot of the experiences that we have inside the open source communities are not coming from a telco background. The language is foreign, some of the concepts are unique, and on the flip side, the telco industry has a very long history of operating in a specific way. It's going to have a certain set of expectations that while we need to be able to meet their expectations, we also need to meet in the middle a little bit. So we're providing the right levels of serviceability and reliability and performance and security without losing our own freedom of defining the exact implementation of that feature set.
Great. Chris and John, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.